The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces is set to hear a case tomorrow about religious liberty, about whether or not members of the military can openly express their religious views, or whether their chain of command has a right to suppress them. It all started when U.S. Marine Corps Lance Corporal Monica Sterling posted a Bible verse in her workspace. Her supervisor took issue with this expression of Christianity and threw the verse in the trash. Sterling restored the verse the next day, but was then hit with a bad conduct discharge and reduction in rank. This case has caused a massive coalition of support for Ms. Sterling from many Americans who support religious liberty as it was written in our Constitution, including 43 members of Congress and 9 retired military generals. Take a look.
America's founders set out to establish something new in the world, creating a society based on the concept that religious beliefs are foundational and must be protected so that freedom would flourish. They came from nations where people were punished if they didn't believe what the government said they should. But our founders envisioned something greater. They envisioned America.
According to our study, between 2011 and 2015, attacks on religious liberty in our country actually doubled. And here at First Liberty, requests for legal help tripled last year.
Joining me now is Senior Counsel and Director of Military Affairs for the Liberty Institute, Mike Berry. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
All right, Mike, give us a condensed timeline of events so we know exactly what happened here.
Well, it's pretty simple. Lance Corporal Sterling is a devout Christian, and she was at work in North Carolina at her military base out there, and she noticed that other people were permitted to put their personal messages, pictures of their family, motivational sayings and whatnot around their workspace, and so she felt inspired to put something that was very important to her faith, which was a Bible verse from the Old Testament book of Isaiah. When her supervisor saw it, her supervisor actually used profanity and told her to remove it. And when Lance Corporal Sterling protested, the supervisor removed it herself and threw it in the trash. And for that, they actually charged Lance Corporal Sterling with the military crime of failure to obey an order. She was sent to a court-martial, she was convicted, she was punished at the court-martial, and her first round of appeal, in the military you have an automatic right of appeal, so the first appellate court, the lower court, actually said that the federal law that protects religious freedom for all federal employees, including members of the military, they said that that law didn't apply to her because posting a Bible verse in your workspace, in their opinion, was not a religious exercise. But then a few paragraphs later, they said that they did think that the order to remove the Bible verse was lawful because anybody who saw it would realize that it was religious and might be offended by it. So their opinion didn't make any sense at all. It was totally nonsense and contradictory, and that's why we're appealing this case to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, who will be hearing this case on April 27th.
So that first appeals court, let me make sure that I get this straight. That first appeals court, the judge basically said that he, as a judge, or she, as a judge, could dictate what constitutes an exercise of religion and have it not based on what the individual thinks is a practice of their faith?
That's exactly right. It was actually a panel of 3 judges, and that's exactly what they said, was that in their opinion, what Lance Corporal Sterling did, displaying a verse from the Holy Bible in her workspace, was not a religious exercise because they didn't feel like it was, in their words, it was not a part of a religious system of belief. And that's something that our Supreme Court and other federal courts have said is not really the appropriate place for judges to be deciding what is or is not somebody's religious beliefs, because then you end up with this crazy scenario where the courts now get to decide people's religion for them. They get to decide what is or is not religious.
Right, I understand what they're saying in the sense that it wasn't going to Mass, receiving Eucharist as a Catholic, or wearing a hijab as a Muslim. It wasn't something dictated in the doctrine of a religion as something that the individual was required to do to follow it. But that doesn't, by any means, say that it's not an exercise of that person's faith, an exercise of a person's religion. It's almost ludicrous to imagine that. What's your defense argument? What are you arguing here?
Well, certainly the strongest argument we have is that the most prominent religious freedom law in our land right now, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the federal RFRA as we call it, protects all members of the military to engage in religious expression, and when the government is going to substantially burden that religious expression, then the government has to show that it has a compelling interest, and that it's the governmental interest is furthered by the least restrictive means. The government can't show that here, and so that's really the heart and soul of our argument, is that Lance Corporal Sterling was denied due process. She was denied the basic protections of this federal law that really, this federal law is built upon constitutional principles, on the First Amendment. And in fact, in 2014, in January of 2014, the Department of Defense, responding to direction by Congress, revised its own regulations to ensure that RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was explicitly applicable to members of the military, so that every person serving in uniform knows without a shadow of a doubt that they have the protection of this federal law. And yet here we are having to fight for the application of that law for Lance Corporal Sterling. So clearly somebody didn't get the message, and that's why it's so important. This case is going to be of historic precedent for members of the military for decades to come, because it will ensure, obviously assuming that we prevail, we're victorious here, but it will ensure that members of the military have the protection of RFRA if they engage in religious exercise.
Right, because our military men and women sacrifice a lot of their freedoms, a lot of their liberty in order to protect ours, but sacrificing their right to practice their faith in the way that they seem fit doesn't seem like one that's necessary for the security of the forces. In all practicality here, Mike, what do you feel is your likelihood of victory in this case?
Well, it's never wise to try to predict what a court will do, especially on the eve of argument before the court. And then even though, the oral argument is April 27th, and it could be another several weeks or months before the court actually announces a decision in the case, it's almost impossible to tell what a court will do. Clearly, we believe that the law is on our side, the Constitution is on our side, we believe the facts are on our side in this case. And speaking of the facts, folks can log on to firstliberty.org or sterlingfacts.com and just see exactly what happened in this case. They can get access to the briefs that have been filed and really see the litany of cases that we have having to defend members of our military. That's one of the things that you mentioned, was that religious hostility in our military is on the increase. And that's really unfortunate because, as you said, the members of our military, when they sign up to serve, when they raise their right hand to swear an oath to defend the Constitution, we voluntarily give up many of our freedoms, but religious freedom is never one of the freedoms that we agreed to give up.
Right. Well, I hope that you'll come back and update us on how this case does go, how the arguments go, what the ruling ends up being. And in the meantime, Mike, please thank Lance Corporal Sterling for her service to our nation. We greatly appreciate it. And I appreciate you coming on the show today. Up next, Chicago Police Department is fielding accusations of systemic racism within their force. Former Chicago police officer and former resident of the South Side of Chicago, Dimitri Roberts, is here with us to tell both sides of that story. Stay with us.